Good evening. Picture this. It's the year 1618, and you're a German peasant waking up to what you think might be just another Tuesday. You step outside your humble cottage, stretch, and notice something peculiar. There are dead bodies scattered across your neighbor's wheat field. Your local church is on fire, and there's a man in fancy armor riding through town, screaming something about religious freedom while systematically burning down every building in sight. Welcome to Europe, where for nearly 1,000 years, this wasn't a nightmare, it was Tuesday. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most blood-soaked mysteries. Why Europe, a continent roughly the size of Canada, managed to perfect the art of butchering itself with such creative enthusiasm that it makes modern reality TV look like a peaceful meditation retreat. We're talking about a place where kings would literally wake up, look at their breakfast, and think, you know what would make this porridge taste better? The screams of my enemies and the sweet, sweet sound of territorial expansion. For centuries, Europe wasn't just a continent. It was a gladiatorial arena, where entire civilizations would duke it out over everything from who gets to wear the fanciest hat, to whether bread should be blessed by a priest, or a different kind of priest. We're talking about wars so relentless that peace treaties were basically just intermissions between massacres. Wars so bloody that they make modern action movies look like children's puppet shows. But why? What turned this relatively small corner of the world into history's ultimate murder playground? Was it politics, religion, economics, pure, unadulterated stupidity? The answer, as we'll discover tonight, is yes to all of the above, with a healthy sprinkle of royal inbreeding, technological innovation used exclusively for human destruction, and enough backstabbing to make Shakespeare weep with joy. We'll explore how Europe's political landscape resembled a medieval game of musical chairs, except every time the music stopped, someone died horribly. We'll delve into religious wars where both sides claimed God was on their side, apparently unaware that the Almighty might have been getting a bit tired of all the praying followed immediately by mass murder. We'll examine dynastic rivalries that made modern family drama look quaint, where cousins would slaughter each other over inheritance disputes that would make estate lawyers rich for centuries. Tonight, you'll learn why the 30 Years' War wasn't just a war, but a continental nervous breakdown that lasted 3 decades. You'll discover how the Crusades turned religious pilgrimage into a blood sport. You'll understand why Napoleon thought conquering all of Europe was a reasonable weekend project. And you'll finally comprehend why, even today, Europeans can't agree on anything except that their ancestors were absolutely insane. Wars in Europe spanned countless borders and centuries, reshaping maps like a cosmic game of Risk played by psychopaths. So tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment, because I'm genuinely curious if any of you are watching from places that exist today only because some European king 400 years ago decided he didn't like the color of someone else's flag. And while you're at it, hit subscribe, because unlike medieval peasants, you actually have the power to decide who rules your screen. And trust me, you'll want to stick around for this journey through history's bloodiest neighborhood. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and prepare to discover why Europe spent nearly a millennium proving that humans are capable of incredible creativity, as long as that creativity is focused on finding new and exciting ways to kill each other en masse. The foundation of chaos. Why Europe was doomed from the start. To understand why European wars were so spectacularly bloody and relentless, we need to go back to the beginning. And by beginning, I mean the moment the Roman Empire decided to have the ancient world's most expensive midlife crisis. Picture the Roman Empire at its peak, a massive, unified superpower stretching from Britain to the Middle East, held together by excellent roads, efficient bureaucracy, and the simple understanding that if you messed with Rome, you'd end up as entertainment in the Colosseum. For centuries, this system worked brilliantly. Sure, there was the occasional civil war, but generally speaking, if you lived within Roman borders, You knew who was in charge, what laws applied to you, and which gods you were supposed to worship. Then, around the 4th and 5th centuries AD, Rome decided to collapse in the most spectacularly inconvenient way possible. It didn't just disappear overnight, which would have been considerate. Instead, it spent several centuries slowly fragmenting, leaving behind a power vacuum the size of a continent and about as many competing factions as there were ways to mispronounce Caesar. When Rome finally shuffled off this mortal coil, it left Europe with a problem that would plague the continent for the next 1,000 years. No one could agree on who was supposed to be in charge of what. Imagine if the United States government suddenly dissolved tomorrow, but instead of 50 states, you had 300 different kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and city-states, each convinced that they were the rightful heir to American power, and each armed to the teeth with an enthusiasm for violence that would make a Viking blush. This is precisely what happened to Europe after Rome's collapse. The continent didn't just fragment politically, it shattered into a jigsaw puzzle made of sharp, pointy pieces, and every piece had its own army, its own laws, its own currency, and its own deeply held beliefs about why everyone else deserved to die. The Holy Roman Empire emerged from this chaos with all the authority of a substitute teacher trying to control a classroom full of sugar-high kindergartners. Officially, the Holy Roman Emperor was supposed to rule over much of Central Europe. In reality, the empire was so decentralized that calling it an empire was like calling a bag of cats a symphony orchestra. The emperor might technically outrank a local duke, but good luck getting that duke to actually listen when the emperor was 3 countries away. And the duke had a castle full of armed knights who were really, really good at zeeking things. Meanwhile, France was emerging as a unified kingdom. But unified is a generous term when your kingdom includes regions that speak different languages, follow different laws, and consider people from the next valley over to be suspicious foreigners. The French kings spent so much time trying to control their own nobles that they barely had energy left over for conquering other countries. Barely. England, safely separated from the continent by the English Channel, looked across the water at this European chaos and thought, you know what this needs? English involvement. The English had this charming habit of periodically deciding that they had legitimate claims to various chunks of France, leading to conflicts like the 100 Years' War, which lasted 116 years, because apparently medieval people were as bad at math as they were at conflict resolution. Spain was busy reconquering itself from the Moors in what was essentially an 800-year-long eviction notice, while simultaneously becoming a global empire so wealthy that it made everyone else jealous enough to start wars, just to get their hands on Spanish gold. The Spanish response to this jealousy was predictably violent. But here's where it gets really interesting. None of these kingdoms existed in isolation, thanks to a medieval obsession with royal marriage as a form of international diplomacy. Every royal family in Europe was related to every other royal family, through a web of marriages so complex that it would make a genealogist weep. This meant that whenever a king died without a clear heir, approximately 17 different royal cousins from 7 different countries would simultaneously declare themselves the rightful successor, each backed by their own armies and their own deeply held conviction that God personally wanted them to rule. These succession crises weren't just political disputes, they were existential threats to entire ways of life. When the last Carolingian died, or when a royal bloodline ended, it wasn't just about changing management. It was about whether your local lord would still protect you, whether the laws you lived under would remain the same, whether the church you attended would still be considered legitimate, and whether you'd wake up tomorrow to find foreign soldiers burning down your village because your new king needed to prove his legitimacy through conquest. The feudal system, which sounds organized in textbooks, was actually a nightmare of competing loyalties that guaranteed conflict. A single knight might owe allegiance to 3 different lords, who themselves served different kings, who were probably second cousins engaged in a bitter inheritance dispute. When war broke out, which it constantly did, choosing sides wasn't just a political decision. It was a life-or-death calculation that could determine whether your family prospered or ended up as casualties in someone else's dynastic squabble. Geography made everything worse. Europe's landscape, with its rivers, mountains, and forests, created natural boundaries that were perfect for forming distinct kingdoms, but terrible for maintaining lasting peace. The Alps divided Italy from the rest of Europe, but not effectively enough to prevent constant invasions. The Rhine created a natural border between France and the German kingdoms, but rivers make excellent highways for armies. The English Channel protected Britain from casual invasion, but wasn't wide enough to prevent the English from constantly meddling in continental affairs. Every natural boundary became a flashpoint for conflict. Rivers were fought over because they controlled trade. Mountain passes were contested because they controlled access between regions. Coastal areas were valuable because they controlled sea trade. Fertile plains were coveted because they could support large armies. Even forests were strategically important because they provided wood for shipbuilding and siege engines. The economic foundation of medieval Europe guaranteed that warfare would be almost constant. The agricultural economy meant that wealth was tied directly to land ownership. You couldn't get rich by starting a tech company or investing in the stock market. You got rich by owning more land than the next guy. And since Europe only contained a finite amount of land, the only way to get richer was to take someone else's property, preferably by force. This created a feedback loop of violence that was almost impossible to break. Successful wars brought wealth and prestige, which attracted more followers, which enabled larger armies, which made it easier to win more wars. Unsuccessful wars meant poverty and vulnerability, which made you a target for more successful neighbors. There was no middle ground, no peaceful path to prosperity. You either conquered or you were conquered. The rise of Christianity, rather than bringing peace, added another layer of complexity to European conflicts. Christianity was supposed to promote peace and love among believers, but medieval Christians had a remarkable talent for finding religious justifications for whatever violence they wanted to commit anyway. The concept of just war allowed Christian rulers to claim divine approval for their military adventures, while the institution of knighthood turned warfare into a religious calling. The Church itself became a major player in European politics, controlling vast territories and wielding enormous influence over royal marriages, succession disputes, and international diplomacy. When the Pope declared a war to be holy, Christian knights weren't just fighting for their king or their land. They were fighting for their eternal souls. This religious dimension transformed ordinary political conflicts into existential struggles between good and evil, making compromise and peaceful resolution almost impossible. The fragmentation of political authority meant that Europe had no effective mechanism for preventing or resolving conflicts peacefully. Unlike empires with centralized authority, medieval Europe had no supreme court, no international law, no neutral arbitrators who could settle disputes without bloodshed. When two kings disagreed about anything, from trade rights to marriage contracts to territorial boundaries, the only reliable way to settle the matter was through trial by combat, scaled up to involve entire armies. Treaties existed, of course, but they were worth about as much as the parchment they were written on. Medieval rulers broke treaties with the same casual frequency that modern people break New Year's resolutions. Why honor an agreement when breaking it might lead to profitable conquest? Why keep your word when your enemies probably wouldn't keep theirs? Trust was a luxury that few could afford when the stakes were literally life and death. This political chaos created a military class that had no peaceful outlet for their skills and ambitions. Knights trained for war from childhood, and in a continent where war was constant, they had plenty of opportunities to practice. The problem was that when wars occasionally ended, You had thousands of professional warriors with no job skills, beyond killing people efficiently, and no source of income except plunder and ransom. These unemployed soldiers didn't just disappear when peace broke out. They formed mercenary companies that sold their services to the highest bidder, or simply became brigands who robbed and pillaged for profit. This meant that even during nominally peaceful periods, Europe was plagued by violence from military entrepreneurs who had every incentive to keep conflicts brewing because war was literally their business model. The technological innovations that Europe developed during this period, rather than bringing prosperity and peace, were focused almost exclusively on making warfare more efficient and deadly. Medieval Europeans pioneered advances in metallurgy, engineering, and chemistry, but these innovations were primarily used to create better weapons, stronger armor, and more effective siege engines. The same ingenuity that could have been used to improve agriculture or medicine was instead devoted to perfecting the art of mass murder. Castle architecture became increasingly sophisticated, not to provide comfortable homes for nobles, but to create more effective military fortifications. Cathedral construction techniques were adapted to build siege engines. Advances in mathematics were used to calculate the trajectory of catapult projectiles. European innovation was impressive, but it was innovation driven by an arms race that made warfare increasingly destructive and expensive. By the time we reached the medieval period, Europe had created a perfect storm of conditions that guaranteed almost continuous warfare. Political fragmentation ensured that there would always be competing claims to power. Economic incentives made conquest more profitable than peace. Religious ideology provided moral justification for violence. Geographic factors created natural flashpoints for conflict. Social structures produced a military class with no peaceful outlet for their ambitions. And technological development focused on making war more effective rather than making peace more attractive. This wasn't just bad luck or historical accident. European culture had evolved in such a way that warfare wasn't an unfortunate necessity. It was a central organizing principle of society. Kings proved their legitimacy through military success. Nobles demonstrated their worth through battlefield prowess. The church gained influence by sanctifying military endeavors. Merchants profited by supplying armies. Even peasants, who suffered most from warfare, often supported their local lord's military adventures because they knew that failure meant conquest by someone else who might be even worse. The stage was set for centuries of conflict that would make Europe the most war-torn continent in human history. The political foundations were unstable. The economic incentives promoted violence. The religious ideology sanctified warfare, and the social structures rewarded military success above all else. All that remained was for specific conflicts to light the fuse on this powder keg, and as we'll see, there would be no shortage of sparks. The irony is that Europe's political fragmentation, which guaranteed so much bloodshed, was also the source of its eventual success. The constant competition between different kingdoms and cities fostered innovation, cultural exchange, and economic development in ways that unified empires often couldn't match. The very instability that made medieval Europe so violent also made it so dynamic. But that's a story for later. First, we need to understand how this unstable foundation led to some of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, starting with mankind's most expensive religious road trip, the Crusades. The Crusades, when religious tourism became mass murder. If you ever wondered what happens when you combine religious fervor, political ambition, economic desperation, and medieval Europe's natural talent for violence, the answer is the Crusades, history's most successful marketing campaign for mass murder, disguised as a holy pilgrimage that somehow lasted for nearly 200 years. The Crusades began in 1095, when Pope Urban II gave what might be history's most effective motivational speech at the Council of Clermont. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant living in squalor. your life expectancy is roughly equivalent to that of a houseplant, and your daily entertainment consists of watching rats fight over scraps of moldy bread. Then suddenly, the Pope's representative shows up and announces that God himself wants you to take a vacation to the Holy Land, where you can achieve eternal salvation, get rich quick, and commit as much violence as you want, all while earning divine approval. It was the medieval equivalent of a timeshare sales pitch, except instead of a free weekend in Florida, you got a one-way ticket to the Middle East with a sword, and the promise that anything you did there was automatically forgiven by the Almighty. The response was so enthusiastic that it probably surprised even the Pope. Suddenly, everyone from unemployed knights to desperate peasants was signing up for what they thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. But here's the thing about the Crusades that makes them particularly fascinating from our perspective. They weren't really about religion. Despite all the religious rhetoric, they were about solving Europe's domestic problems by exporting them to someone else's backyard, with a thin veneer of spiritual justification to make everyone feel better about the massive bloodbath that was about to ensue. By 1095, Europe had several intractable problems. First, there were too many knights and not enough legitimate wars to keep them busy. The feudal system had produced a warrior class that was trained for nothing but violence, and when they weren't fighting foreign enemies, they spent their time fighting each other or terrorizing peasants. The church was constantly complaining about the violence that these idle warriors inflicted on Christian communities, but no one had figured out what to do with a bunch of professional killers during peacetime. Second, younger sons of noble families were becoming a serious social problem. Medieval inheritance laws typically gave everything to the eldest son, leaving younger brothers with excellent military training, expensive tastes, and absolutely no legal way to support themselves. These disinherited nobles often became bandits, mercenaries, or rebels, creating instability throughout Europe. The church needed somewhere to send these surplus warriors before they destabilized Christian kingdoms. Third, the Byzantine Empire, which controlled Constantinople and served as a buffer between Christian Europe and the expanding Islamic world, was in serious trouble. The Byzantines had been steadily losing territory to various Turkish armies and had sent desperate pleas to Western Europe for military assistance. This gave the Pope a perfect excuse to frame European aggression as defensive warfare. Finally, the medieval economy was stagnating. Europe's agricultural system could barely feed its population. There were few opportunities for trade with the wealthy Islamic world, and the continent's gold reserves were running low. A successful military expedition to the east could potentially solve all of these problems at once, while conveniently removing Europe's most problematic citizens from the domestic scene. Pope Urban II's brilliant insight was realizing that he could package European expansion as a religious obligation. Instead of admitting that they were launching a war of conquest to grab land and loot, European leaders could claim they were liberating the Holy Land from infidel occupation. Instead of acknowledging that they were sending their surplus population to die in foreign wars, they could frame the Crusades as a spiritual pilgrimage that offered salvation to participants. The propaganda campaign was masterfully executed. Crusade preachers traveled throughout Europe, promising that participation would guarantee forgiveness for all sins, both past and future. They claimed that crusaders who died in battle would go straight to heaven, bypassing purgatory entirely. They spread lurid stories about Islamic persecution of Christian pilgrims, most of which were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. They promised that the Holy Land was flowing with milk and honey, just waiting for Christian settlers to claim their rightful inheritance. But the most effective part of the Crusade marketing campaign was economic. The church promised that crusaders could delay payment of their debts, that their property would be protected while they were away, and that they could legitimately plunder any non-Christian communities they encountered. For heavily indebted knights and land-hungry nobles, the Crusades offered a chance to solve their financial problems while earning religious merit. The response exceeded everyone's expectations. The First Crusade attracted somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 participants, far more than anyone had anticipated. But here's where the European talent for chaos really shone. Nobody had actually planned how to organize, supply, or transport this massive army to the Middle East. The result was a logistical nightmare that began killing crusaders long before they reached the Holy Land. The journey itself became an exercise in European incompetence and brutality. Different crusading armies took different routes to Constantinople, and most of them treated the trip as an extended looting expedition. They robbed and murdered their way across Europe, attacking Jewish communities, extorting money from Christian cities, and generally behaving like a plague of locusts with religious pretensions. The People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, was particularly disastrous. This was essentially a mob of peasants, including women and children, who had been promised that their faith alone would guarantee victory. They had no military training, no proper equipment, and no logistical support. Most of them died before reaching Jerusalem, either from disease, starvation, or encounters with actual trained soldiers who were less impressed by their religious enthusiasm than they had expected. Even the official military expeditions faced enormous challenges. Medieval armies had no experience with long-distance campaigns. They didn't know how to preserve food for extended periods, how to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles, or how to coordinate between different national contingents that spoke different languages and followed different tactical doctrines. The Crusader armies that eventually reached the Holy Land were a fraction of their original size, having lost most of their number to disease, desertion, and logistical failures. But the survivors were highly motivated, extremely violent, and convinced that God was personally directing their actions. When they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, after a siege that lasted over a month, they celebrated their victory by massacring virtually every inhabitant of the city, regardless of age, gender, or religion. Contemporary accounts describe crusaders wading through blood that reached their ankles, slaughtering not just Muslims and Jews, but also Eastern Christians who had the misfortune to look foreign. This massacre wasn't an unfortunate accident or an isolated atrocity. It was the logical culmination of a military expedition that had been framed as a holy war from the beginning. If you convince people that their enemies are agents of Satan who deserve no mercy, if you promise divine rewards for violence, if you structure your entire campaign around the premise that any brutality is justified in service of a sacred cause, then genocide becomes not just possible but inevitable. The success of the First Crusade, measured purely in terms of territorial conquest, encouraged further expeditions. Over the next 200 years, European powers organized dozens of crusades, not just to the Holy Land, but also to Spain, Eastern Europe, and anywhere else where Christians could find non-Christians to fight. The Crusades became a permanent institution, a way of channeling European violence toward external targets while providing religious and economic justification for what was essentially a series of aggressive wars. But here's what made the Crusades particularly brutal, even by medieval standards. They combined the worst aspects of religious warfare with the worst aspects of colonial conquest. Religious wars are especially vicious because they frame political conflicts in absolute moral terms, making compromise impossible and encouraging atrocities against enemies who are seen as inherently evil. Colonial wars are brutal because they involve cultural clashes between peoples who don't understand each other and often don't recognize each other's humanity. The Crusades were both religious and colonial wars, fought by European armies that saw themselves as divinely appointed liberators against Middle Eastern populations that they regarded as both heretical and racially inferior. This combination produced a level of systematic brutality that shocked even contemporary observers who were accustomed to medieval violence. The military tactics employed during the Crusades reflected this mentality. Crusader armies regularly slaughtered prisoners, not just to save resources, but because they believed that killing infidels was a religious duty. They besieged cities until entire populations starved, justifying mass civilian deaths as necessary for the recovery of Christian territory. They established crusader states that were essentially military occupations, ruling over hostile populations through systematic terror and exploitation. The Islamic response to the Crusades was initially confused and fragmented, but it gradually became more organized and more brutal in return. Muslim leaders like Saladin, who are often praised by modern historians for their relative moderation, still executed crusader prisoners and expelled Christian populations from reconquered territories. The cycle of revenge and counter-revenge escalated throughout the crusading period, with each side using the other's atrocities to justify their own. The economic impact of the Crusades was enormous and largely negative for everyone involved. The expeditions cost European kingdoms vast sums of money that could have been used for peaceful development. The Crusader states in the Middle East were never economically self-sufficient and required constant subsidies from Europe. The disruption of trade routes and the destruction of Middle Eastern cities damaged commerce throughout the region. Even the Italian city-states that profited from transporting crusaders and supplies eventually suffered when the crusading movement collapsed, and their investments in Eastern trade became worthless. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Crusades was cultural. The expeditions brought Europeans into contact with Islamic civilization, which was at the time more advanced than Christian Europe in many areas, including medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and technology. However, instead of leading to peaceful cultural exchange, the Crusades created lasting mutual hostility between Christian and Islamic civilizations that continues to influence international relations today. The Crusades also established several dangerous precedents that would plague European warfare for centuries afterward. They demonstrated that religious rhetoric could be used to justify almost any level of violence, as long as the targets were defined as enemies of the faith. They showed that popular enthusiasm for holy war could be manufactured through effective propaganda campaigns. They proved that international military expeditions could be organized and financed through religious institutions, independent of normal diplomatic channels. Most importantly, the Crusades established the principle that European Christians had a divine right to conquer and occupy any territory they could claim for religious reasons. This ideology would later be used to justify European colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The same theological arguments that Pope Urban II used to launch the First Crusade were recycled by Spanish conquistadors, Portuguese explorers, and later European imperialists. The military experience gained during the Crusades also had lasting effects on European warfare. Crusader armies learned new siege techniques from Middle Eastern opponents. They adopted Eastern weapons and armor designs. They developed new methods of logistics and supply that would be used in later European wars. The military orders established during the Crusades, like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, became models for later military organizations. But perhaps most significantly, the Crusades taught European rulers that foreign wars could be used to solve domestic problems. Kings learned that they could export their surplus population, distract attention from internal disputes, and potentially acquire new resources through military expeditions justified by religious rhetoric. This lesson would be applied repeatedly in later European conflicts, from the Reconquista in Spain to the Northern Crusades in Eastern Europe to the colonial expeditions of the early modern period. The eventual failure of the Crusades, marked by the fall of Acre in 1291, didn't end European enthusiasm for holy war. It just redirected that enthusiasm toward new targets. The same religious and cultural attitudes that had motivated crusaders to attack Muslims in the Middle East were soon applied to campaigns against heretics in southern France, pagans in Eastern Europe, and eventually indigenous peoples in the Americas. When we examine the Crusades from the perspective of European military history, what's most striking is how they established patterns of behavior that would characterize European warfare for centuries afterward. The use of religious ideology to justify political aggression, the systematic exploitation of cultural differences to dehumanize enemies, the willingness to commit massive atrocities in pursuit of strategic objectives, and the tendency to frame wars of conquest as defensive or liberating actions. The Crusades weren't an aberration in European history. They were a preview of coming attractions. They showed the world what happened when European political ambition, religious fanaticism, economic desperation, and technological innovation were combined in service of military expansion. And as we'll see when we examine later European conflicts, the lessons learned during the Crusades would be applied on an even larger scale, with even more devastating results. The bloody legacy of the Crusades helps explain why European wars remained so relentlessly violent. They established cultural and institutional precedents that made extreme brutality not just acceptable but religiously praiseworthy, as long as it was directed toward the right targets. This was a civilization that had convinced itself that mass murder could be a form of worship, and once that psychological barrier was broken, there was really no limit to the horrors that European armies would be willing to inflict in pursuit of their objectives. But the Crusades were just the opening act. As medieval Europe matured and developed more sophisticated political institutions, military technologies, and economic systems, its capacity for organized violence would grow exponentially. The religious wars of the Reformation period would make the Crusades look like minor border skirmishes, and the dynastic conflicts of the early modern period would demonstrate just how creative Europeans could be when it came to finding new reasons to kill each other en masse. The 100 Years' War, when cousins fight over who gets to wear the crown. Now, if you thought the Crusades were violent, wait until you hear about what happened when two royal families spent 116 years arguing over who had the better claim to the French throne. The 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, wasn't just a war. It was a multi-generational family feud with a body count that would make the mafia weep with admiration. The whole thing started because medieval royalty had this charming habit of marrying their cousins to forge political alliances, creating family trees that looked less like trees and more like abstract art drawn by someone having a nervous breakdown. By the 14th century, the English and French royal families were so intermarried that determining who had legitimate claims to what throne required a degree in both genealogy and advanced mathematics. The immediate cause of the war was the death of Charles IV of France in 1328 without a male heir. This presented a problem. France followed Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line, while England was perfectly happy to trace royal legitimacy through anyone who could hold a sword and had the right bloodline. Edward III of England looked at his family tree, noticed that his mother was the sister of the dead French king, and thought, you know what, I deserve to be king of France too. The French, predictably, disagreed with this assessment. They had already crowned Philip VI, who was Charles IV's cousin through the male line, and they weren't particularly interested in having their kingdom ruled by someone who lived across the English Channel and spoke French with what they considered an unacceptably terrible accent. This disagreement might have been resolved through diplomacy, negotiation, or perhaps a strongly worded letter. Instead, it was resolved through 116 years of nearly continuous warfare that devastated both countries and killed roughly 2.3 to 3.3 million people. What made this conflict particularly brutal was that it wasn't just a war between two armies. It was a war between two entire civilizations, each convinced that the other represented everything wrong with the world. The English saw the French as effete, corrupt, and morally inferior. The French saw the English as crude barbarians who had no business ruling over the civilized people of France. Both sides were probably right. The early phases of the war showcased European military innovation at its most destructive. The English had developed a revolutionary military technology called the longbow, which could penetrate armor at distances of up to 200 yards and could be fired much more rapidly than traditional crossbows. English archers were drawn primarily from the lower classes, which created an interesting social dynamic. Peasants with longbows could kill mounted knights, who represented the pinnacle of medieval military aristocracy. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 demonstrated just how effective this new technology could be. The French army included the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, knights who had trained their entire lives for combat and war armor that cost more than most people's houses. The English army included a large contingent of Welsh archers, who were essentially medieval snipers with a talent for mass murder. When the French knights charged, they probably expected the usual medieval battle, lots of individual combat, opportunities for honorable single combat, and the chance to capture enemies for ransom. Instead, they ran into a hailstorm of arrows that turned the battlefield into a slaughter. Contemporary accounts describe arrows falling as thick as snow, and French knights dying by the hundreds before they could even reach the English lines. But here's what made the 100 Years' War particularly vicious. It established the principle that killing prisoners was militarily advantageous. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, Henry V ordered the execution of captured French nobles, not because he was particularly cruel, but because he was outnumbered and couldn't spare the troops needed to guard prisoners. This decision shocked contemporary observers, who expected captured nobles to be held for ransom, not murdered outright. The precedent set at Agincourt spread throughout European warfare. If killing prisoners provided military advantages, then keeping them alive was essentially a luxury that commanders couldn't afford. This transformation of military culture from one that valued honorable conduct toward prisoners to one that prioritized practical effectiveness regardless of moral considerations would characterize European warfare for centuries afterward. The economic impact of the 100 Years' War was devastating for both countries, but particularly for France, where most of the fighting took place. Entire regions were depopulated through warfare, famine, and disease. Agricultural production collapsed as peasants fled their fields or were killed by passing armies. Trade networks that had taken centuries to develop were destroyed in a matter of decades. But the war also created new economic opportunities for violence entrepreneurs. Companies of unemployed soldiers, called routiers or accoucheurs, literally flayers, roamed the countryside during truces, supporting themselves through robbery, extortion, and pillage. These mercenary bands became a permanent feature of the European landscape, ensuring that even when official wars ended, violence continued. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the middle of the 100 Years' War, might have been expected to reduce the scale of violence by killing off potential soldiers. Instead, it made the wars more vicious by creating social instability and economic desperation that fueled further conflict. Regions depopulated by plague became targets for military occupation. Survivors competed more desperately for remaining resources. Labor shortages led to social upheaval as peasants demanded better conditions and nobles responded with increased repression. The war's most famous figure, Joan of Arc, perfectly embodied the religious and nationalistic fanaticism that made European conflicts so destructive. Joan claimed that she had received divine visions instructing her to drive the English out of France and ensure the coronation of the Dauphin Charles. Whether or not she actually received divine revelations, her conviction was absolute, and her willingness to die for her cause inspired similar fanaticism among her followers. Joan's military career was brief, but spectacularly effective. She broke the English siege of Orleans, defeated several English armies, and largely turned the tide of the war in France's favor. Her success demonstrated that religious enthusiasm could be a force multiplier that made ordinary soldiers capable of extraordinary achievements. but it also showed how religious conviction could justify almost any level of violence in pursuit of supposedly sacred objectives. When Joan was eventually captured by Burgundian allies of the English and sold to English authorities, they faced a problem. They couldn't simply execute her as a prisoner of war without making her a martyr. Instead, they arranged for her to be tried for heresy and witchcraft, charges that would justify burning her at the stake while discrediting her religious claims. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc revealed another disturbing aspect of European warfare: the systematic use of judicial proceedings to legitimize political murders. By framing Joan's execution as the result of an ecclesiastical trial rather than a military decision, the English could claim that they were upholding religious law rather than simply killing an effective enemy. This technique of using legal or religious institutions to justify politically motivated violence would become a standard feature of European conflicts. The final phase of the 100 Years' War demonstrated how military technology continued to make warfare more destructive. The French had learned from their early defeats and developed new military techniques that combined traditional heavy cavalry with gunpowder weapons, professional infantry, and improved siege technology. When they began their counteroffensive in the 1440s, they were able to recapture English territories with a speed and efficiency that shocked contemporary observers. The Siege of Castellon in 1453, which effectively ended the 100 Years' War, showcased the devastating potential of artillery warfare. The French used cannons to break the walls of English fortifications and to massacre English armies in the field. The English commander, John Talbot, was killed when a cannonball struck his horse, symbolically marking the end of an era in which individual heroism and traditional cavalry charges could determine the outcome of battles. But the end of the 100 Years' War didn't bring peace to Europe. It just relocated the violence. English forces that had been fighting in France returned home just in time for the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that would consume England for the next 30 years. French armies that had been unified against the English immediately began fighting each other as various noble factions competed for influence over the monarchy. The long-term consequences of the 100 Years' War extended far beyond the immediate participants. The conflict established several precedents that would shape European warfare for centuries afterward. It demonstrated that nationalism could be a more powerful motivating force than feudal loyalty. It showed that new military technologies could quickly shift the balance of power between different social classes and different nations. It proved that economic warfare, including the systematic destruction of enemy agricultural and commercial resources, could be as effective as traditional battlefield victories. Most importantly, the 100 Years' War established the principle that dynastic disputes could justify virtually unlimited violence. If royal bloodlines gave rulers legitimate claims to foreign territories, then any war fought in defense of those claims was automatically justified, regardless of the human cost. This principle would be used to rationalize European conflicts for the next several centuries. As various royal families pressed hereditary claims to territories throughout the continent, the war also demonstrated the effectiveness of national propaganda in motivating popular support for military endeavors. Both English and French authorities developed sophisticated techniques for convincing their populations that the enemy represented an existential threat to their way of life. These propaganda campaigns were so successful that they created lasting national stereotypes and mutual hatred that persisted long after the original political disputes had been resolved. The Italian Wars, Renaissance art meets Renaissance warfare. Just when you thought European warfare couldn't get any more creatively destructive, the Italian Renaissance arrived to prove that the same culture that produced Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci could also produce some of the most innovative and brutal military campaigns in human history. The Italian Wars, which lasted from 1494 to 1559, were what happened when Renaissance creativity was applied to the ancient art of mass murder, with predictably spectacular results. Italy in the late 15th century was a patchwork of city-states, papal territories, and small kingdoms, each with its own government, its own army, and its own deeply held conviction that it deserved to rule over everyone else. Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States had spent centuries developing sophisticated political institutions, patronizing incredible art, and fighting each other with a frequency that would make modern sports fans proud. But Italian warfare had evolved into something almost civilized by medieval standards. Most conflicts were fought by professional mercenary companies called condottieri, who had a vested interest in keeping wars limited and casualties low. After all, dead soldiers couldn't fight in future campaigns, and destroyed cities couldn't pay for military services. Italian warfare had become almost ritualistic, with elaborate maneuvers, negotiated battles, and outcomes that rarely threatened the fundamental political structure of the peninsula. Then the French arrived, and everything went to hell. Charles VIII of France looked at the Italian peninsula in 1494 and saw an opportunity to revive the medieval dream of French expansion into Italy. He claimed hereditary rights to the Kingdom of Naples through his Angevin ancestors, gathered an army of 25,000 men, and marched across the Alps with the confident expectation that Italian resistance would collapse as soon as the Italians realized they were facing a real army rather than their usual mercenary pageants. He was absolutely right. The French army that invaded Italy in 1494 was unlike anything the Italians had seen before. These were battle-hardened veterans who had learned their trade during the final phases of the 100 Years' War. They used new military technologies, including improved artillery and firearms, that could reduce Italian fortifications to rubble in a matter of hours. Most importantly, they approached warfare with a level of systematic brutality that shocked Italian observers. When the French captured the city of Monte San Giovanni in 1495, they didn't negotiate terms or arrange for honorable surrender. They simply massacred the entire garrison and looted the city. When they besieged Naples, they used artillery to breach the walls, and then allowed their soldiers to sack the city for 3 days. This wasn't the civilized warfare that Italians were accustomed to. This was total war, conducted by armies that had learned to see violence as a tool for achieving strategic objectives, rather than as a ritualistic display of martial prowess. The Italian response was predictably chaotic. Instead of uniting against the French invasion, Italian states immediately began calculating how they could profit from the situation. Venice allied with France, hoping to acquire territory from Milan. The Pope supported France because he wanted French help against his Italian enemies. Florence tried to remain neutral while secretly negotiating with all sides. Only Milan and Naples actually opposed the French invasion, and they were quickly overwhelmed by enemies who understood that war was a serious business rather than an elaborate game. But the French success in Italy attracted attention from other European powers, who had their own reasons for wanting to control Italian territories. Spain had hereditary claims to Naples and Sicily through the Crown of Aragon. The Holy Roman Empire considered much of northern Italy to be part of the imperial domain. Even England eventually became involved, primarily to prevent any single power from dominating European politics. What followed was 65 years of almost continuous warfare that turned Italy into Europe's primary battlefield. Armies from France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states fought each other with a ferocity that made previous Italian conflicts look like friendly competitions. Cities were besieged, captured, lost, and recaptured multiple times. Entire regions were depopulated through warfare, famine, and disease. The Renaissance culture that had flourished in 15th century Italy was systematically destroyed by armies that valued strategic advantage over cultural preservation. The Italian wars introduced several military innovations that would make European warfare even more destructive. Artillery technology advanced rapidly as different armies competed to develop more effective siege weapons. The Spanish developed new infantry tactics, based on integrated units of pikemen and arquebusiers that could defeat traditional cavalry charges. The French perfected the use of field artillery to break up enemy formations. The Germans contributed new designs for fortifications that could withstand artillery bombardment. But the most significant innovation was the systematic use of mercenary armies recruited from throughout Europe. Instead of relying primarily on feudal levies or national armies, the major powers began hiring professional soldiers from wherever they could find them. Swiss pikemen, German Landsknechts, Spanish tercia, and French gendarmes all fought in Italy, often switching sides based on whoever could pay them the most. These international mercenary forces had no loyalty to Italian cities, no investment in Italian culture, and no reason to show restraint when dealing with Italian civilians. They were professional soldiers whose primary concerns were getting paid and staying alive, and they quickly learned that systematic intimidation and occasional atrocities were effective ways to discourage resistance and encourage prompt payment of tribute. The sack of Rome in 1527 perfectly illustrated the destructive potential of this new style of warfare. The army responsible for this atrocity was nominally in the service of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, but it included German Lutheran soldiers who viewed the Pope as the Antichrist, Spanish Catholics who wanted revenge for perceived Italian treachery, and various mercenaries who were primarily interested in loot. When this army reached Rome, they found a city that was essentially defenseless. Pope Clement VII had relied on diplomacy and bribery to avoid military confrontation, but the imperial army was beyond the point where diplomatic solutions were possible. They had not been paid for months. They were angry about previous defeats, and they saw Rome as an opportunity to solve all their problems through systematic plunder. The resulting sack lasted for weeks. Churches were looted, priests were murdered, nuns were raped, and artistic treasures that had taken centuries to create were destroyed for the value of their gold and silver components. Contemporary accounts describe German soldiers using religious artwork for target practice and Spanish troops stabling their horses in St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope fled to Castel Sant'Angelo and remained a prisoner there for months, while his city was methodically destroyed. The sack of Rome was shocking even by the standards of 16th century warfare, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Similar atrocities occurred throughout Italy as different armies competed for strategic advantages. The siege of Naples in 1528 resulted in the death of roughly half the city's population from warfare, famine, and disease. The siege of Florence in 1529 to 1530 lasted for 10 months, and ended only when the city's population was literally starving to death. What made these Italian wars particularly destructive was that they were fought with Renaissance efficiency and medieval brutality. The armies involved were larger, better organized, and more technologically advanced than any previous European forces, but they were operating in a political environment that provided no effective constraints on their behavior. International law was primitive, diplomatic institutions were weak, and there were no neutral powers capable of mediating between the combatants. The economic impact of the Italian wars was catastrophic. Italy had been the wealthiest region of Europe in the 15th century, with flourishing commercial networks, advanced manufacturing, and sophisticated financial institutions. The wars destroyed much of this prosperity through direct military action and the disruption of trade routes. Cities that had been centers of international commerce became military targets. Banking houses that had financed European trade were bankrupted by the cost of warfare. But the cultural impact was perhaps even more significant. The Italian Renaissance had represented a flowering of human creativity and intellectual achievement that influenced art, literature, philosophy, and science throughout Europe. The wars didn't just destroy specific artworks and buildings. They shattered the social and economic conditions that had made Renaissance culture possible. Patronage networks that had supported artists and scholars for generations were destroyed when wealthy families fled or were bankrupted by warfare. Libraries and universities were looted or abandoned. Artists and intellectuals were forced to seek employment as military engineers or propaganda specialists rather than pursuing creative or scholarly work. The optimistic humanism that had characterized early Renaissance culture was replaced by a more pessimistic worldview that reflected the realities of living in a continent dominated by warfare. The Italian wars also demonstrated the bankruptcy of medieval political institutions when confronted with modern military technology and organization. The Holy Roman Empire, which claimed authority over much of Italy, proved incapable of either protecting or controlling its Italian territories. The Papal States, despite their supposed spiritual authority, were reduced to hiring mercenaries and forming military alliances like any secular power. The Italian city-states, which had pioneered sophisticated forms of republican government, were unable to resist conquest by foreign monarchies with larger armies. By the time the Italian wars ended with the Treaty of Catacambrisis in 1559, the political map of Italy had been fundamentally transformed. Spain controlled Naples, Sicily, and Milan. France had been expelled from the peninsula entirely. The Papal States survived, but were reduced to the status of a Spanish client state. Venice maintained its independence, but lost most of its mainland territories. Florence became a Spanish protectorate ruled by the Medici family under Spanish protection. More importantly, the Italian wars established precedents that would influence European warfare for centuries afterward. They demonstrated that artillery could make traditional fortifications obsolete, leading to an arms race between offensive and defensive technologies that would consume enormous resources. They showed that professional armies could be more effective than feudal levies, encouraging the development of standing armies that would become a financial burden on European states. They proved that systematic destruction of enemy economic and cultural resources could be as important as battlefield victories, legitimizing total war as a strategic doctrine. They established the principle that foreign intervention in regional conflicts was not only acceptable but necessary to maintain the balance of power, ensuring that local disputes would regularly escalate into continental wars. Perhaps most significantly, the Italian wars demonstrated that Renaissance Europe's increased wealth, technological capability, and organizational sophistication would be used primarily to make warfare more devastating rather than to create lasting peace. The same cultural forces that had produced the artistic and intellectual achievements of the Renaissance had also produced military innovations that would make the next several centuries of European conflict more brutal and destructive than anything the medieval period had seen. The Italian wars ended, but the lessons learned during those conflicts would soon be applied on an even larger scale. The religious divisions created by the Protestant Reformation were about to provide European powers with new justifications for warfare, while the military technologies and strategic doctrines developed during the Italian campaigns would make the coming religious wars far more destructive than anyone could have imagined. The 30 Years' War, Europe's mental breakdown. If you want to understand just how completely insane European warfare could become when left unchecked, the 30 Years' War is the perfect case study. This wasn't just a war. It was a continental nervous breakdown that lasted from 1618 to 1648, killed somewhere between 4 and 12 million people, and demonstrated that when Europeans really put their minds to it, they could create conflicts so destructive that they made previous wars look like polite disagreements between neighbors. The 30 Years' War began, as so many European conflicts did, with a perfectly ridiculous incident that should have been resolved with a strongly worded diplomatic note. In 1618, Protestant nobles in Bohemia were upset about the succession of Ferdinand II, a Catholic Habsburg to the Bohemian throne. Instead of filing a formal complaint or perhaps organizing a petition, they decided to express their displeasure by throwing two Catholic officials and their secretary out of a window in Prague Castle. This event, known as the Defenestration of Prague, was actually the second defenestration in Prague's history, because apparently throwing people out of windows was Prague's traditional method of political protest. The officials survived the 70-foot fall, which Catholics attributed to divine intervention and Protestants attributed to landing in a pile of manure. Both explanations were probably correct. Under normal circumstances, this incident might have led to some heated diplomatic exchanges, perhaps a few small military skirmishes, and eventually a negotiated settlement. Instead, it triggered a 30-year conflict that would consume most of Europe and establish new standards for military brutality, civilian suffering, and general civilizational self-destruction. The problem was that by 1618, Europe had developed several interconnected systems of religious, political, and economic rivalry that turned every local dispute into an excuse for continental warfare. The Protestant Reformation had divided European Christianity into competing camps that viewed each other as existential threats. The Habsburg family controlled both the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, creating a power bloc that dominated European politics and threatened the independence of every other major kingdom. The development of professional armies and improved military technology had made warfare more expensive and more destructive than ever before. Most importantly, European rulers had learned that foreign wars could solve domestic problems. Kings who faced rebellious nobles, economic difficulties, or religious dissent could distract attention from these issues by launching military campaigns against external enemies. The 30 Years' War would demonstrate just how catastrophic this strategy could become when multiple powers applied it simultaneously. The war began as a relatively straightforward religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces within the Holy Roman Empire. Ferdinand II, as Holy Roman Emperor, was determined to restore Catholic unity to his domains through a combination of political pressure and military force. Protestant princes and cities were equally determined to resist what they saw as religious tyranny. Both sides had legitimate grievances, reasonable strategic objectives, and absolutely no understanding of what they were about to unleash. The early phases of the war followed traditional patterns of European conflict. Armies maneuvered for strategic advantage, besieged important cities, and fought battles that determined temporary control over specific territories. The Catholic League, supported by Spanish money and troops, achieved several early victories against Protestant forces. It looked like the war might end relatively quickly, with a Catholic victory and the restoration of religious unity under Habsburg authority. Then other European powers decided to get involved, and the conflict spiraled completely out of control. Denmark entered the war in 1625, ostensibly to protect Protestant interests, but actually to acquire German territories that would strengthen Danish control over Baltic trade routes. Sweden joined in 1630, claiming to defend Protestant religious freedom, but actually seeking to establish Swedish hegemony over Northern Europe. France entered in 1635, officially to prevent Habsburg domination of Europe, but actually to acquire territory along the Rhine and in the Spanish Netherlands. By the 1630s, the 30 Years' War had become a freefall involving virtually every major European power, dozens of minor states, and countless mercenary armies that had their own agendas. The original religious issues that had started the conflict were increasingly irrelevant as Catholic France allied with Protestant Sweden against Catholic Spain and the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. What mattered wasn't religious doctrine, but strategic advantage and territorial gain. This transformation of a religious war into a purely political conflict removed the last moral restraints on military conduct. When armies believed they were fighting for sacred principles, they could at least claim that their brutality served divine purposes. When armies were fighting merely for political advantage and territorial gain, there was no justification for restraint except practical military considerations. The result was a level of systematic destruction that shocked contemporary observers. Armies lived off the land through organized plunder, not because supply systems had broken down, but because systematic looting was cheaper and more effective than traditional logistics. Cities were besieged, not just for strategic reasons, but because successful sieges provided opportunities for profitable sack. Civilian populations were terrorized, not as an unfortunate byproduct of warfare, but as a deliberate strategy for discouraging resistance and encouraging tribute payments. The Siege of Magdeburg in 1631 perfectly illustrated the destructive potential of this new style of warfare. Magdeburg was a wealthy Protestant city that had refused to submit to Catholic authority. When imperial forces under General Tilly finally captured the city after a 2-month siege, they celebrated their victory by systematically destroying everything they couldn't steal. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers methodically burning buildings, murdering civilians regardless of age or gender, and competing to see who could commit the most creative atrocities. By the time the sack ended, roughly 25,000 of the city's 30,000 inhabitants were dead, and Magdeburg had been reduced to smoking ruins. The destruction was so complete that the city didn't recover its pre-war population until the 19th century. The sack of Magdeburg wasn't an isolated incident or an unfortunate accident. It was standard operating procedure for armies that had learned to use terror as a weapon. Similar atrocities occurred throughout Germany, as different armies competed to see who could extract the most resources from civilian populations, while discouraging resistance through systematic brutality. But what made the 30 Years' War particularly devastating was that it introduced industrial-scale military logistics to European warfare. Earlier wars had been limited by the difficulty of feeding and supplying large armies over extended periods. Armies had to disperse during winter, return home for harvest seasons, and generally conduct campaigns on schedules that allowed for agricultural and economic activities. The armies of the 30 Years' War solved these logistical problems by systematically exploiting occupied territories. Instead of maintaining expensive supply lines, they simply took whatever they needed from local populations. Instead of limiting campaigns to specific seasons, they established permanent garrisons that could extract tribute year-round. Instead of demobilizing during truces, they maintained standing armies that continued to live off occupied territories while preparing for the next phase of warfare. This system was highly effective from a military perspective, but it was absolutely catastrophic for civilian populations. Regions that had the misfortune to be strategically important were subjected to decades of organized plunder. Agricultural production collapsed as peasants were killed, fled, or were impressed into military service. Trade networks that had taken centuries to develop were destroyed by armies that viewed merchants as sources of tribute rather than economic assets. The demographic impact of the 30 Years' War was extraordinary. Some regions of Germany lost up to 60% of their population through warfare, famine, disease, and emigration. Entire cities were abandoned as inhabitants fled or died. Agricultural areas reverted to wilderness as farming became impossible. The Holy Roman Empire, which had been one of the most prosperous regions of Europe at the beginning of the 17th century, was reduced to an economic wasteland that took generations to recover. But the war's impact extended far beyond immediate military destruction. The 30 Years' War represented the breakdown of medieval institutions and the emergence of modern state systems based on centralized authority and professional military forces. The Holy Roman Empire, which had provided at least nominal political unity to Central Europe for centuries, was effectively destroyed as a meaningful political institution. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 recognized the sovereignty of individual German states and established the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories without external interference. This transformation from medieval universalism to modern nationalism had profound implications for European warfare. If every state was sovereign within its borders, then there were no higher authorities that could mediate disputes or enforce international law. If rulers could determine their subjects' religion, then religious differences became matters of state policy rather than universal truth. If territorial boundaries were determined by military success rather than traditional authority, then warfare became the ultimate arbitrator of political disputes. The military innovations developed during the 30 Years' War would influence European warfare for centuries afterward. The Swedish army under Gustavus Adolphus pioneered new tactical formations that integrated firearms, artillery, and cavalry in highly effective combined arms operations. Spanish tercios demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations armed with pikes and muskets. The rise of military engineering as a specialized profession led to improvements in both offensive and defensive technologies that made warfare more scientific and more destructive. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the 30 Years' War was psychological. The conflict had demonstrated that European civilization was capable of destroying itself through warfare. The sophisticated political institutions, religious traditions, and cultural achievements that Europeans had developed over centuries could be swept away by armies that treated destruction as a military strategy rather than an unfortunate necessity. This realization led to a fundamental shift in European political thinking. The medieval ideal of universal Christian unity was replaced by the modern concept of balance of power, in which stability was maintained through the threat of mutual destruction rather than through shared moral principles. The religious enthusiasm that had motivated earlier conflicts was replaced by a more cynical approach to international relations that treated warfare as a continuation of politics by other means. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, established diplomatic principles that would govern European international relations until the 20th century. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of individual states, prohibited interference in domestic affairs, and established the principle that territorial changes should be achieved through negotiation rather than conquest. But these diplomatic innovations didn't eliminate European warfare. They just made it more systematic and more limited. Future conflicts would be fought according to more clearly defined rules, with greater attention to international law, and with more sophisticated diplomatic mechanisms for ending hostilities. But they would still be fought, because the underlying political, economic, and cultural factors that had made the 30 Years' War possible hadn't been eliminated. The 30 Years' War ended, but it had established precedents that would shape European warfare for the next several centuries. It had demonstrated that systematic destruction of enemy resources could be an effective military strategy. It had shown that professional armies could be maintained indefinitely through organized exploitation of occupied territories. It had proved that religious and ideological differences could be used to justify virtually unlimited violence. Most importantly, it had shown that European civilization was capable of levels of self-destruction that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The same cultural and technological forces that had produced the Renaissance and the Reformation had also produced military capabilities that could reduce entire regions to wasteland within a matter of decades. As European powers recovered from the devastation of the 30 Years' War and began rebuilding their military capabilities, they would apply the lessons learned during that conflict to even more ambitious projects of conquest and expansion. The age of absolute monarchy was about to begin, and with it would come wars that would make the 30 Years' War look like a minor regional conflict. The age of Louis XIV, when one man's ego consumed a continent. If you ever wondered what happens when you give unlimited power to someone with the personality of a reality TV star and the military resources of a major European kingdom, Louis XIV of France provides the perfect case study. Known as the Sun King, Louis spent most of his 72-year reign proving that absolute monarchy and continental peace were fundamentally incompatible concepts. Louis XIV came to the throne in 1643 as a 5-year-old child, which meant that for the first part of his reign, France was governed by regents who had the good sense to focus on internal reconstruction after the devastation of the 30 Years' War. But when Louis began ruling in his own right in 1661, he immediately set about turning France into Europe's dominant military power and himself into the most feared monarch since Charlemagne. The problem with absolute monarchy, from a peace perspective, is that it concentrates all political decision-making in the hands of a single individual whose personal ambitions, insecurities, and delusions of grandeur become matters of international policy. Louis XIV believed that he ruled by divine right, that France deserved to dominate Europe, and that military conquest was the most reliable way to achieve glory and demonstrate royal authority. These beliefs might have remained harmless megalomaniacal fantasies if Louis hadn't also inherited the most efficient state bureaucracy and the largest standing army in European history. By the 1660s, France had a population of roughly 20 million people, making it by far the most populous country in Western Europe. French agriculture was productive enough to support large non-agricultural populations. French manufacturing and commerce generated sufficient wealth to fund massive military expenditures. French administrative institutions were sophisticated enough to organize and supply armies that dwarfed anything that other European powers could field. Louis XIV looked at these advantages and reached the logical conclusion that France should use its superior resources to acquire as much additional territory as possible, as quickly as possible, before other European powers could develop countermeasures. This strategy was militarily sound, economically rational, and diplomatically catastrophic, because it convinced every other European ruler that French expansion represented an existential threat to their own survival. The War of Devolution, which began in 1667, established the pattern that would characterize Louis XIV's reign. Louis claimed that Spanish territories in the Low Countries should pass to France through his wife's inheritance rights, a claim that was legally dubious but backed by an army of 50,000 men. When Spanish resistance collapsed almost immediately, other European powers realized that they needed to take collective action to prevent French hegemony. The resulting conflict involved France against a coalition that eventually included Spain, the Dutch Republic, England, Sweden, and various German states. From Louis's perspective, this was simply evidence that his enemies were ganging up on him out of jealousy and fear. From everyone else's perspective, French expansion threatened the balance of power that had maintained relative stability since the Peace of Westphalia. But what made Louis XIV's wars particularly destructive was that they were fought with professional armies that had learned to use systematic devastation as a strategic weapon. The French army under Marshal Vauban had perfected siege warfare to such a degree that few fortifications could resist French attacks for more than a few months. When cities surrendered promptly, they were typically spared serious damage. When they resisted, they were systematically destroyed as an example to other potential opponents. The bombardment of Brussels in 1695 perfectly illustrated this new approach to warfare. Brussels had no significant military value. It was targeted purely to demonstrate French power and to pressure the Spanish Netherlands into accepting French demands. French artillery methodically destroyed the city's central square, including the magnificent town hall that had been a masterpiece of Gothic architecture. The bombardment served no military purpose except to show that French forces could destroy anything they chose to target. This transformation of cultural and economic targets into legitimate military objectives represented a significant escalation in European warfare. Previous conflicts had generally focused on controlling strategic positions, defeating enemy armies, and forcing political concessions through battlefield victories. Louis XIV's wars established the principle that enemy civilian infrastructure was a legitimate target for systematic destruction, regardless of its military significance. The economic warfare pioneered during Louis XIV's reign was equally systematic. French armies didn't just occupy enemy territories. They methodically destroyed enemy economic resources to prevent future resistance. Farmlands were burned, orchards were cut down, mills and workshops were demolished, and trade routes were disrupted. The goal wasn't just military victory, but the long-term weakening of enemy states through economic devastation. The War of the League of Augsburg, which lasted from 1688 to 1697, demonstrated the full destructive potential of this approach. Louis XIV faced a coalition that included England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and several smaller powers. Instead of seeking a negotiated settlement, Louis chose to escalate the conflict by systematically devastating enemy territories. The destruction of the Palatinate in 1689 became one of the most notorious atrocities of the period. French forces under Marshal Melik received orders to create a desert between France and its enemies by destroying everything of value in the German territories along the Rhine. Over the course of several months, French soldiers systematically burned cities, destroyed castles, cut down vineyards, and massacred civilian populations who couldn't flee quickly enough. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic nature of this destruction. French engineers calculated the most efficient methods for demolishing buildings. French soldiers followed detailed instructions for destroying agricultural resources. French administrators kept meticulous records of the devastation they had inflicted. This wasn't random violence or undisciplined looting. It was organized state terrorism conducted according to military manuals and strategic plans. The human cost of these policies was enormous. Entire regions were depopulated as civilians fled the advancing French armies. Refugee populations strained the resources of German cities that tried to provide shelter and food. Agricultural production collapsed in areas that had been systematically devastated. Trade networks that had taken decades to develop were destroyed within a matter of months. But the most significant long-term consequence of Louis XIV's wars was that they established a new standard for international conflict. If one major power was willing to use systematic economic warfare and terror tactics against civilian populations, then all major powers needed to develop similar capabilities in self-defense. The military innovations pioneered by French forces during the late 17th century were quickly adopted by their enemies and spread throughout European military establishments. The War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701, represented the culmination of this arms race. When the last Spanish Habsburg died without a direct heir, Louis XIV claimed the Spanish throne for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. This would have created a Franco-Spanish empire controlling most of Western Europe and much of the colonial world, a prospect that terrified every other European power. The resulting conflict lasted until 1714 and involved virtually every European state in what was essentially the First World War, with battles fought in Europe, North America, South America, and India. The scale of the military forces involved was unprecedented. At various times, France fielded armies totaling over 400,000 men, while the Allied coalition deployed even larger forces. But what made this conflict particularly devastating was that it was fought according to the strategic principles that Louis XIV had established during his earlier wars. All sides used systematic economic warfare, deliberate targeting of civilian populations, and organized devastation of enemy territories as standard military tactics. The War of the Spanish Succession wasn't just a political dispute over dynastic succession. It was a continental struggle for survival in which all participants believed that failure meant national destruction. The Siege of Turin in 1706 demonstrated the destructive potential of early 18th century warfare. The city endured a 4-month siege that reduced much of the urban area to ruins. Artillery bombardments destroyed residential neighborhoods, churches, and public buildings that had no military significance. Civilian casualties numbered in the thousands. not as accidental victims of military operations, but as deliberate targets of strategic terror campaigns. The Battle of Malplaquet in 1709 was even more revealing of how European warfare had evolved. This was a traditional battlefield confrontation between professional armies, but it resulted in over 30,000 casualties in a single day. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but it demonstrated that European armies had become so large and so well equipped that even minor engagements could produce casualty rates that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The economic impact of Louis XIV's wars was catastrophic for all participants. France spent enormous sums maintaining armies that at times included over 400,000 men, far larger than any previous European military force. The cost of these military expenditures consumed most of the royal revenue and forced the French government to adopt increasingly desperate financial expedients, including the sale of government offices, the debasement of currency, and the imposition of new taxes that generated widespread popular unrest. But France's enemies faced similar financial pressures. England financed its participation through government borrowing that created a permanent national debt. The Dutch Republic spent so much on military expenses that it never recovered its position as a major European power. The Holy Roman Empire was forced to extract tribute from German states that were already struggling to recover from the devastation of previous conflicts. By the time the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, all of Europe was financially exhausted, demographically depleted, and economically disrupted. The peace treaties that ended the conflict didn't resolve the underlying political issues that had caused the war. They simply redistributed territories and established temporary truces that would last only until the next generation of rulers decided to resume the struggle for European dominance. Louis XIV died in 1715, having spent most of his long reign demonstrating that absolute monarchy and European peace were fundamentally incompatible. His wars had established new standards for military violence, systematic economic warfare, and deliberate targeting of civilian populations. They had also demonstrated that even the wealthiest and most powerful European states could be brought to the brink of collapse through extended military conflicts. The legacy of Louis XIV's reign extended far beyond France's borders. The military innovations developed during his wars were adopted throughout Europe. The strategic principles he established became standard doctrine in European military academies. The administrative techniques his government pioneered for organizing and supplying large armies were copied by other European powers. Most importantly, Louis XIV's wars had established the concept of balance of power as the organizing principle of European international relations. Since no single power could be allowed to dominate the continent, all major powers needed to maintain military capabilities sufficient to participate in coalitions against any potential hegemon. This meant that European states would be in a permanent state of military preparedness, with professional armies, sophisticated intelligence services, and alliance systems designed to respond quickly to any threat to the existing balance. The Napoleonic Wars, when Europe met its match, just when European powers thought they had figured out how to manage their continental balance of power system, along came Napoleon Bonaparte to prove that all their careful diplomatic arrangements were utterly useless when confronted by someone who combined military genius with complete disregard for international law, traditional authority, and common sense. Napoleon was the perfect product of European political and military evolution, a man whose talents were ideally suited to the warfare that Europe had been perfecting for centuries, but whose ambitions were so vast that he would ultimately destroy the very system that had created him. He understood better than any of his contemporaries how to use the military innovations, administrative techniques, and political concepts that European civilization had developed, but he applied these tools in pursuit of objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with European stability. The French Revolution had already destabilized European politics by demonstrating that popular uprisings could overthrow ancient monarchies, and that revolutionary ideologies could motivate mass armies with a fervor that traditional mercenary forces couldn't match. But the revolution had also created internal chaos in France that seemed to limit its threat to the existing international order. European monarchs were confident that revolutionary France would either collapse from internal contradictions or be contained. Through traditional diplomatic and military measures, Napoleon proved them spectacularly wrong. By the time he seized power in 1799, he had already established himself as the most successful military commander in European history. His victories in Italy had demonstrated that revolutionary armies could defeat professional forces through superior organization, tactics, and motivation. His administrative reforms had shown that revolutionary governments could be more efficient than traditional monarchies. His political instincts had revealed that popular nationalism could be a more powerful force than feudal loyalty or dynastic legitimacy. But what made Napoleon truly dangerous was that he combined these revolutionary innovations with a strategic vision that encompassed all of Europe. Unlike previous European conquerors, who had typically sought to acquire specific territories or achieve limited objectives, Napoleon aimed to reorganize the entire continental political system according to his own design. He wanted to create a European empire that would be more extensive than Rome, more unified than Charlemagne's realm, and more efficient than any previous political organization. This ambition might have remained a harmless megalomaniacal fantasy if Napoleon hadn't also been a military innovator who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of traditional European armies. The military system that had evolved during the 17th and 18th centuries was based on professional soldiers, careful logistics, and limited objectives. Armies were expensive to maintain, difficult to replace, and commanded by aristocratic officers who were more concerned with preserving their forces than with achieving decisive victories. Napoleon revolutionized European warfare by developing military methods that were specifically designed to destroy traditional armies through rapid movement, concentrated attacks, and relentless pursuit of defeated enemies. His armies moved faster than their opponents because they lived off the land rather than depending on elaborate supply trains. They hit harder because they concentrated superior force at decisive points rather than spreading their strength along extended fronts. They achieved more decisive results because they pursued defeated enemies until resistance collapsed completely, rather than allowing them to retreat and regroup. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 perfectly demonstrated the effectiveness of these methods. Napoleon faced a coalition army that included Austrian and Russian forces commanded by experienced generals and organized according to the best European military practices. The coalition army was actually larger than Napoleon's force and occupied a strong defensive position that should have given them significant advantages. Napoleon won the battle by convincing his enemies to abandon their defensive position and attack him in a location where he could use concentrated artillery and rapid troop movements to destroy their forces piecemeal. The resulting victory was so complete that it effectively knocked Austria out of the war and forced Russia to retreat beyond its borders. More importantly, it demonstrated that traditional European military methods were obsolete when confronted by commanders who understood how to use speed, concentration, and psychological warfare to achieve strategic objectives. But Austerlitz was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Napoleon would defeat every major European power in a series of campaigns that redrew the political map of the continent. Prussia, which had been considered one of Europe's premier military powers, was effectively destroyed as an independent state after the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. Austria was repeatedly defeated and forced to accept territorial losses and political subordination to French hegemony. Russia was driven out of Central Europe and compelled to join Napoleon's continental system designed to exclude British trade from European markets. What made these victories particularly devastating for the traditional European order was that Napoleon didn't just defeat enemy armies, he destroyed the political systems that had supported them. When he conquered German territories, he abolished the Holy Roman Empire and reorganized German states according to French administrative models. When he occupied Italian territories, he eliminated traditional aristocratic privileges and imposed legal systems based on the Napoleonic Code. When he controlled Spanish territories, he attempted to replace traditional monarchy with a modern bureaucratic state governed by his brother Joseph. This systematic transformation of European political institutions was far more threatening to the established order than simple military conquest would have been. Previous conquerors had typically been content to extract tribute and political submission. While leaving local institutions largely intact, Napoleon sought to create a unified European system based on legal equality, administrative efficiency, and rational government, principles that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional European aristocracy, religious authority, and local autonomy. The response to Napoleon's success was predictably desperate. European powers that had been enemies for centuries formed coalitions specifically designed to contain French expansion. Britain, which had traditionally avoided extensive involvement in continental affairs, committed enormous resources to organizing and financing anti-French alliances. Russia, Austria, and Prussia, despite their mutual antagonisms, repeatedly allied against Napoleon even after suffering catastrophic defeats. But what made the Napoleonic Wars particularly destructive was that they were fought by all sides according to the strategic principles that Louis XIV had established and that Napoleon had perfected. All participants used systematic economic warfare, deliberate targeting of civilian populations, and organized devastation of enemy territories as standard military tactics. The scale of these operations, however, was far larger than anything Europe had previously experienced. The Peninsular War, which began in 1808 when Napoleon attempted to conquer Spain and Portugal, perfectly illustrated the destructive potential of early 19th century warfare. Spanish resistance to French occupation took the form of guerrilla warfare that systematically targeted French supply lines, isolated garrisons, and administrative personnel. French forces responded with counterinsurgency operations that included mass executions, systematic torture, and the destruction of entire villages suspected of supporting guerrilla activities. Contemporary accounts describe French forces burning Spanish cities, executing civilian hostages, and systematically destroying agricultural resources in regions that supported guerrilla resistance. Spanish guerrilla forces retaliated by massacring French prisoners, attacking French collaborators, and using terror tactics against civilian populations that cooperated with French authorities. British forces supporting Spanish resistance contributed to the cycle of atrocities by encouraging Spanish guerrilla warfare while providing insufficient support to prevent French retaliation. The result was a 6-year conflict that devastated the Iberian Peninsula and killed roughly 500,000 people, most of whom were civilians caught between competing military forces. The Peninsular War demonstrated that Napoleonic warfare, when applied to counterinsurgency operations, could produce levels of systematic brutality that exceeded anything Europe had previously experienced. The Russian campaign of 1812 revealed another dimension of Napoleonic warfare's destructive potential. Napoleon assembled an army of over 600,000 men, including forces from every European state under French influence, for what he intended to be the decisive campaign that would force Russia to submit to French hegemony and complete his domination of continental Europe. The campaign was a logistical masterpiece that demonstrated the organizational capabilities that European states had developed by the early 19th century. Napoleon's army was larger than the entire population of many European cities. It included soldiers from dozens of different nationalities, speaking different languages and following different military traditions. It was supplied through administrative systems that coordinated production and transportation across most of Europe. But the Russian strategy of trading space for time, combined with the logistical impossibilities of maintaining such a large army at such vast distances from its supply bases, turned Napoleon's organizational triumph into a humanitarian catastrophe. Russian forces retreated systematically while destroying everything that could be useful to the invading army. French forces found themselves in control of enormous territories that contained no resources to support their continued operations. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest military disasters in European history. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 30,000 returned in any condition to fight. Most died from starvation, disease, and exposure rather than in battle. The Grand Army, which had been the finest military force in European history, simply disintegrated as a fighting organization. But the human cost of the Russian campaign extended far beyond military casualties. The systematic destruction of resources during the Russian retreat left vast areas of Eastern Europe uninhabitable for civilian populations. Refugee movements disrupted agricultural production and spread disease throughout the region. The collapse of French administrative systems in occupied territories created political chaos that would take years to resolve. The final coalition wars that led to Napoleon's defeat were fought with a ferocity that reflected the existential nature of the conflict. By 1813, all sides understood that the war would determine not just the political map of Europe, but the fundamental nature of European civilization. Napoleon was fighting to preserve an empire that extended from Spain to Poland and from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. His enemies were fighting to restore a traditional order based on dynastic legitimacy, aristocratic privilege, and religious authority. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, involved over 500,000 soldiers and resulted in roughly 100,000 casualties over 3 days of fighting. The scale of this battle was unprecedented in European history, but it was not exceptional by the standards of Napoleonic warfare. Similar engagements occurred throughout the final campaigns, as both sides committed all available resources to achieve decisive results. The economic impact of the Napoleonic Wars was catastrophic for all participants. France spent enormous sums maintaining armies that at times included over 1 million men deployed throughout Europe. The continental system, designed to exclude British trade from European markets, disrupted commercial networks that had taken centuries to develop. The constant warfare prevented normal agricultural and manufacturing activities in much of Europe for over a decade. Britain financed its resistance to Napoleon through government borrowing that created debt levels that wouldn't be equaled until the 20th century. Prussia, Austria, and Russia were forced to restructure their entire societies to mobilize resources for total war against French hegemony. Even neutral countries suffered from the disruption of international trade and the pressure to choose sides in a conflict that ultimately involved most of the known world. By the time Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Europe had experienced warfare on a scale that would not be matched until the world wars of the 20th century. The Napoleonic Wars had demonstrated that European states could organize military forces and conduct operations that dwarfed anything previously achieved in human history. They had also demonstrated that such warfare could threaten the survival of European civilization itself. The Congress of Vienna, which established the post-Napoleonic political order, represented an attempt by European statesmen to create institutional arrangements that would prevent future conflicts from reaching the level of destructiveness that had characterized the Napoleonic period. The concept of balance of power was refined and institutionalized through formal alliance systems and regular diplomatic conferences. The principle of legitimacy was restored to limit the appeal of revolutionary ideologies. International law was developed to provide some constraints on the conduct of warfare, but these innovations didn't eliminate the fundamental factors that had made European warfare so destructive. Nationalism, which Napoleon had exploited so effectively, continued to destabilize the multinational empires that dominated Eastern Europe. Industrial development was beginning to provide European states with unprecedented resources for military purposes. Colonial expansion was creating new sources of conflict as European powers competed for control over global markets and resources. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, but they had established precedents and expectations that would influence European warfare for the next century. They had demonstrated that total war was possible, that entire societies could be mobilized for military purposes, and that political objectives could justify virtually unlimited destruction. Most ominously, they had shown that European civilization's capacity for organized violence was increasing at a rate that far exceeded its capacity for creating effective institutions to control that violence. The road to World War, how Europe perfected the art of self-destruction. By the mid-19th century, European civilization had reached a peculiar crossroads. On one hand, the continent had achieved levels of prosperity, technological sophistication, and cultural achievement that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. European cities were marvels of engineering and architecture. European science and philosophy were transforming human understanding of the natural world. European industry was producing wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything previously achieved in human history. On the other hand, Europe had also perfected the art of warfare to such a degree that its capacity for self-destruction had grown exponentially. The same industrial techniques that were creating unprecedented prosperity were being applied to military purposes with predictably devastating results. The same scientific methods that were advancing human knowledge were being used to develop more effective weapons. The same organizational capabilities that were making European states more efficient were making European armies more deadly. The period between the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914 is sometimes called the Long Peace because Europe avoided major continental wars for almost a century. But this label is deeply misleading, because the period was characterized by constant military preparation, numerous smaller conflicts, and the systematic development of military technologies and strategies that would make the next major European war far more destructive than anything previously experienced. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain during the late 18th century and spread throughout Europe during the 19th century, transformed every aspect of military affairs. Steam-powered transportation allowed armies to move troops and supplies with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Telegraph communications enabled military commanders to coordinate operations across vast distances in real time. Mass production techniques made it possible to equip enormous armies with standardized weapons and equipment. But perhaps the most significant impact of industrialization was that it gave European states the economic resources to maintain large standing armies during peacetime. Previous European military systems had been limited by the cost of keeping professional soldiers when they weren't actively engaged in warfare. Industrial economies could support military establishments that would have bankrupted agricultural societies, making permanent military preparedness economically feasible for the first time in European history. The development of nationalism during the 19th century provided European states with a new source of military manpower and motivation. The concept of the nation-state, in which political authority was based on cultural and linguistic identity rather than dynastic legitimacy, created emotional bonds between governments and populations that could be exploited for military purposes. Citizens who identified with their national governments were willing to serve in armies, pay taxes for military expenses, and make personal sacrifices for military objectives in ways that subjects of traditional monarchies had never been. But nationalism also created new sources of international conflict. The principle of national self-determination implied that every culturally distinct population deserved its own independent state, a principle that was fundamentally incompatible with the multinational empires that controlled much of Eastern and Southern Europe. The Austrian Empire included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, and dozens of other ethnic groups. The Ottoman Empire controlled Turks, Arabs, Bulgarians, Serbs, Greeks, and Armenians. The Russian Empire included Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Balts, and numerous other nationalities. Each of these ethnic groups had potential claims to national independence, and each had potential allies among existing European nation-states who shared their cultural identity. German nationalism implied that all German-speaking populations should be united under German political authority. Pan-Slavism suggested that all Slavic peoples should be liberated from foreign rule and united under Russian protection. Italian unification required the expulsion of Austrian forces from northern Italy. These nationalist movements were inherently expansionist and inevitably brought different European powers into conflict. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, completed in 1871, fundamentally altered the European balance of power. The new German Empire combined the largest population in Europe west of Russia with the most advanced industrial economy and the most efficient military organization. German unification had been achieved through 3 successful wars against Denmark, Austria, and France that demonstrated the superiority of German military methods over traditional European approaches to warfare. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, in particular, revealed how industrial technology and modern organization could make warfare far more decisive and destructive than previous conflicts. The Prussian army used railroads to mobilize and deploy forces faster than the French could respond. Prussian artillery, using new breech-loading technology, outranged and outgunned French weapons. Prussian staff work, based on systematic military education and careful planning, enabled German forces to coordinate complex operations that overwhelmed French resistance. The Siege of Paris, which lasted for 4 months, demonstrated the potential for industrial warfare to create humanitarian catastrophes, even when military operations were conducted according to traditional rules. The German blockade of Paris was militarily effective but created conditions that led to widespread civilian starvation. By the end of the siege, Parisians were eating rats, cats, and animals from the zoo. The siege ended only when the French government agreed to pay an enormous indemnity and cede Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. The German victory over France created a new European power structure in which Germany was clearly the dominant continental force, but it also created a dynamic that made future conflict almost inevitable. France was determined to recover its lost territories and restore its position as a major European power. Russia was concerned about German expansion toward Eastern Europe. Britain was worried about German naval construction and commercial competition. Austria-Hungary needed German support to maintain control over its diverse ethnic populations. These concerns led to the formation of competing alliance systems that were supposed to maintain European stability through the threat of mutual destruction. The Triple Alliance linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in a defensive agreement. The Franco-Russian alliance combined French financial resources with Russian military manpower. The Entente Cordiale between Britain and France resolved colonial disputes and established informal cooperation against German expansion. But alliance systems that were designed to prevent war actually made war more likely by ensuring that any local conflict would escalate into a general European confrontation. The logic of alliance commitments meant that European powers could not allow their allies to be defeated without risking their own security. This created incentives for early mobilization and preventive warfare that made diplomatic solutions to international disputes increasingly difficult. The arms race that developed during the late 19th and early 20th centuries demonstrated how industrial capabilities could be applied to military purposes with devastating results. European powers competed to build larger armies, more powerful weapons, and more advanced military technologies. Defense spending consumed increasingly large portions of government budgets. Military service became a central experience for entire generations of young European men. Naval competition was particularly intense, as European powers sought to protect their overseas empires and commercial networks. The development of steel warships powered by steam engines and armed with rifled artillery created opportunities for naval battles that would dwarf anything previously experienced. The construction of dreadnought battleships, beginning in 1906, made previous naval technologies obsolete overnight and forced all major naval powers to begin completely new construction programs. But the most ominous development was the application of scientific methods to military problems. European armies established staff colleges that trained officers in systematic approaches to warfare. Military academies taught engineering, mathematics, and logistics as essential components of professional military education. Government-sponsored research programs developed new weapons technologies, improved military communications, and refined tactical doctrines. This scientification of warfare created military establishments that were far more capable than previous European armies, but it also created a professional military culture that valued efficiency and effectiveness over humanitarian considerations. Military planning focused on achieving strategic objectives through the most direct means possible, regardless of civilian casualties or economic destruction. The concept of total war, in which entire societies would be mobilized for military purposes, became accepted doctrine in European military circles. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 provided a preview of what European warfare would look like when these various factors combined. The conflicts in southeastern Europe involved all the elements that would characterize World War I, nationalist movements seeking independence from multinational empires, great power competition for influence in strategically important regions, alliance commitments that escalated local disputes into international crises, and military technologies that made warfare far more destructive than previous generations had experienced. The First Balkan War, in which Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro attacked the Ottoman Empire, demonstrated how quickly modern armies could achieve decisive results against opponents who hadn't adopted the latest military innovations. Ottoman forces, despite fighting on their own territory and defending strategic positions, were overwhelmed by enemies who used modern artillery, improved logistics, and systematic staff work. The Second Balkan War, in which the victors of the First War fought each other over the division of conquered territories, showed how difficult it was to establish lasting peace when nationalist movements had conflicting territorial claims. Bulgaria attacked its former allies and was quickly defeated by a coalition that included not only Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, but also Romania and the Ottoman Empire. Both Balkan Wars were characterized by systematic atrocities against civilian populations, the deliberate destruction of enemy economic resources, and the use of terror tactics to discourage resistance. Contemporary observers noted that the level of brutality exceeded what had been considered acceptable in European warfare, but they failed to recognize that these conflicts were previews of what would happen when similar methods were applied on a continental scale. By 1914, European civilization had created the perfect conditions for a catastrophic war. Industrial technology had provided the means to equip and supply enormous armies. Nationalist ideology had provided the motivation for populations to support extended military efforts. Alliance systems had ensured that any significant conflict would involve multiple major powers. Military doctrine had established total war as an acceptable strategy for achieving political objectives. All that remained was a spark to ignite this carefully constructed powder keg. That spark came in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, when a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne. The assassination itself was a relatively minor incident of the type that had occurred frequently in the Balkans, without causing major international crises. But by 1914, the European political system had become so unstable that even minor incidents could trigger continental conflicts. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia to support Austria-Hungary. France declared war on Germany to support Russia. Britain declared war on Germany to support France, and because German forces had violated Belgian neutrality, within 6 weeks, most of Europe was at war, and the conflict would eventually involve over 30 countries and kill more than 15 million people. World War I wasn't an accident or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was the logical culmination of centuries of European military, political, and cultural development that had created a civilization capable of incredible achievements, but also capable of unprecedented self-destruction, the blood-soaked legacy of European ambition. And so, after nearly an hour of exploring Europe's 1,000-year journey through the valley of the shadow of death, we arrive at the inevitable conclusion: Europeans didn't stumble accidentally into centuries of relentless, bloody warfare. They systematically created the perfect conditions for it, refined it into an art form, and then acted shocked when it finally consumed their entire civilization. Looking back at this sprawling tapestry of violence, from the collapse of Rome through the Crusades, from the 100 Years' War through the Napoleonic conflicts, and finally to the industrial slaughter of World War I, certain patterns emerge with the clarity of bloodstains on fresh snow. First, Europeans developed a unique talent for transforming every possible human difference into a justification for mass murder. Religious differences, time for a crusade, dynastic disputes, let's have a century-long war, cultural identities, perfect excuse for ethnic cleansing. Economic competition obviously requires military intervention. Territorial boundaries, definitely worth killing millions of people to adjust by a few miles. What made European warfare so particularly vicious was that it wasn't random violence or uncontrolled chaos. It was systematic, organized, and constantly improving through technological innovation and strategic refinement. Europeans approached warfare like they approached everything else, with scientific rigor, industrial efficiency, and an obsessive attention to detail that would have been admirable if it hadn't been applied to the business of killing people en masse. The economic incentives that drove European expansion were particularly pernicious. In a continent where land was the primary source of wealth, where royal authority depended on military success, and where technological advancement was primarily directed toward military applications, peace wasn't just boring, it was economically irrational. European societies had structured themselves in such a way that warfare was more profitable than peace, more prestigious than diplomacy, and more reliable than trade for achieving political objectives. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of European military culture was its tendency to frame every conflict in absolute moral terms, whether they were fighting for religious salvation, dynastic legitimacy, national honor, or cultural superiority. Europeans consistently convinced themselves that their enemies weren't just political opponents, but existential threats to civilization itself. This moral absolutism made compromise impossible and atrocities inevitable, because any level of violence could be justified in defense of supposedly sacred principles. The technological dimension of European warfare was equally important. The same intellectual curiosity and innovative spirit that produced the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were consistently applied to military problems with devastating effectiveness. Europeans pioneered advances in metallurgy, chemistry, engineering, and mathematics, but these innovations were primarily used to create more effective weapons, stronger fortifications, and more efficient methods of mass destruction. By the 20th century, European civilization had achieved the dubious distinction of creating military capabilities that exceeded its political wisdom, economic resources, and moral constraints. The result was World War I, a conflict so devastating that it essentially ended European global dominance and began the process of civilizational transformation that continues today. The irony of European military history is that the same characteristics that made Europeans so effective at warfare, innovation, competition, and organization, were also the characteristics that eventually created modern industrial society, democratic government, and international law. The constant pressure of military competition forced European states to become more efficient, more responsive to popular needs, and more capable of complex organizational tasks. The devastation of 2 world wars finally convinced Europeans that their traditional approach to international relations was literally suicidal in an era of industrial warfare. The European Union, NATO, and the various international institutions created after 1945 represent attempts to channel European competitive instincts toward peaceful purposes, while maintaining the organizational capabilities that had made European civilization so dynamic. But the legacy of Europe's bloody past extends far beyond European borders. The military technologies, strategic doctrines, and political concepts developed during centuries of European warfare were exported throughout the world through colonialism and cultural influence. The nation-state system, the concept of total war, the use of industrial technology for military purposes, and the idea that political objectives can justify unlimited violence, all European innovations, became the foundation of modern international relations. The European approach to warfare also established precedents for systematic genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity that would be applied on a global scale during the 20th century. The Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, the killing fields of Cambodia, and countless other atrocities can all trace their intellectual and organizational roots to techniques of systematic violence that were pioneered in European conflicts. Today, as we watch conflicts around the world, we can see the continuing influence of European military culture. The same combination of technological sophistication, organizational efficiency, and moral absolutism that characterized European warfare continues to shape how modern conflicts are fought. The same tendency to frame political disputes in existential terms, to use systematic destruction as a strategic weapon, and to target civilian populations for military purposes remains a central feature of contemporary warfare. But we can also see signs of progress. International humanitarian law, the concept of war crimes, the development of international criminal courts, and the growing recognition that some methods of warfare are inherently illegitimate, all represent attempts to impose moral and legal constraints on military violence. These innovations are largely responses to the horrors that European-style warfare produced during the 20th century. The United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the Geneva Conventions, and various arms-control treaties represent humanity's attempt to learn from Europe's bloody history and create institutional mechanisms that might prevent future conflicts from reaching the same level of destructiveness. Whether these institutions will prove effective in constraining human violence remains to be seen, but their existence demonstrates that the lessons of European warfare haven't been entirely lost. The story of European warfare is ultimately a story about the relationship between human creativity and human destructiveness. Europeans weren't uniquely violent or uniquely evil. They were uniquely effective at organizing violence and applying technological innovation to military purposes. The same intellectual and organizational capabilities that made European civilization so successful also made European warfare so devastating. Perhaps the most important lesson from this bloody history is that technological capability without moral wisdom is a recipe for catastrophe. European civilization developed the ability to kill people on an industrial scale long before it developed effective institutions for preventing such killing. The result was centuries of unnecessary suffering that culminated in 2 world wars that nearly destroyed European civilization entirely. As we face contemporary challenges involving nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and climate change. The European example provides both a warning and a source of hope. The warning is that human technological capabilities can exceed human wisdom, with potentially catastrophic results. The hope is that humans can learn from their mistakes and create institutions that channel technological capabilities toward beneficial rather than destructive purposes. The blood-soaked history of European warfare reminds us that peace isn't the natural state of human affairs. It's an achievement that requires constant effort, institutional innovation, and moral commitment. The fact that Western Europe has enjoyed relative peace for the past 75 years isn't an accident or an inevitable result of historical progress. It's the product of deliberate choices by political leaders who learned from their predecessors' mistakes and created institutional arrangements designed to make warfare less likely and less destructive. But this peace remains fragile and dependent on continued commitment to the principles and institutions that maintain it. The resurgence of nationalism, the development of new military technologies, and the emergence of new forms of international competition all pose challenges to the post-war European order. Whether Europeans will be able to maintain their hard-won peace while adapting to changing circumstances remains one of the most important questions facing contemporary civilization. The ultimate message of European military history is both sobering and hopeful. Humans are capable of incredible creativity and organization, but these capabilities can be used for either constructive or destructive purposes. The choice between civilization and barbarism isn't made once and for all. It's made repeatedly, in countless decisions by individuals and institutions who must choose between cooperation and conflict, between wisdom and folly, between peace and war. Europe's 1,000 years of warfare demonstrate what happens when societies choose conflict over cooperation, when they prioritize military success over human welfare, and when they allow competitive instincts to overwhelm moral constraints. But Europe's transformation since 1945 demonstrates that these choices aren't permanent, that institutions can be reformed, and that even the most violent societies can learn to live in peace. The blood that soaked European soil for centuries wasn't spilled in vain if we learn from it. The millions who died in European wars won't have died meaninglessly if their sacrifice teaches us to choose peace over war, cooperation over competition, and wisdom over folly. The challenge for contemporary civilization is to remember these lessons while we still have time to apply them. As we face an uncertain future filled with new forms of conflict and new destructive capabilities, the European example reminds us that the choice between civilization and barbarism remains ours to make. We can choose to repeat the mistakes of the past, or we can choose to learn from them. We can choose to glorify violence, or we can choose to celebrate peace. We can choose to prepare for war, or we can choose to build institutions that make war less likely. The Europeans who spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare weren't fundamentally different from us. They were intelligent, creative, and capable of both great achievements and great atrocities. Their history is our history, their choices are our choices, and their legacy is our responsibility. Whether that legacy leads to continued progress toward a more peaceful world, or to new cycles of violence and destruction, depends on the choices we make today. The bloody history of European warfare ends not with a conclusion, but with a question. What will we choose? The answer to that question will determine whether future historians look back on our era as a time when humanity finally learned to live in peace, or as just another chapter in the long, sad story of human beings killing each other, for reasons that future generations will find as incomprehensible as we find the European wars of the past. That choice, like all the choices that shaped European history, is ours to make. The question is, will we make it wisely, or will we add our own chapter to the blood-soaked annals of human folly? Only time will tell, but the European example suggests that the stakes couldn't be higher, Because the next time humans decide to settle their differences through industrial-scale warfare, there may not be anyone left to learn from the mistakes. And with that cheerful thought, I leave you to contemplate the wonderful species you belong to and the magnificent civilization you've inherited. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the capacity for both incredible creativity and incredible destruction lies within every human society, including our own. The Europeans proved that intelligence, organization, and technological capability are no guarantee against catastrophic stupidity. Let's hope we prove them wrong. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Europe's 1,000 years of creative violence. If you enjoyed this exploration of how civilization can go spectacularly wrong, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more cheerful historical content, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of human folly you'd like me to explore. Until next time, remember, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do learn from history are apparently doomed to watch others repeat it anyway. But hey, at least we have Netflix now, so we can watch the apocalypse in high definition with surround sound. Progress.